Hey there, it's Justin Colletti of Sonic Scoop, and today we're going to be talking all about mix bus compression. This is a part of the mixing process that a lot of people don't get figured out really well until they've been doing it for quite a while. But hopefully, after today's talk, you're going to be able to kind of jump ahead in your skills, your comfort, and your confidence in using mix bus compression. You have probably heard a lot of conflicting advice on this one. I was going through videos the other day on YouTube, as you might be doing right now or might be doing with some frequency, and I came across some videos about 10 tips I found on YouTube that weren't that great. And the one this guy started off with was those people who tell you to start with your mix bus compressor early and mix into it. Those people are crazy, he said. So this guy was recommending that you do a lot of your mixing first and then put your mix bus compressor on later. So you've probably heard both of those pieces of advice. Just like you've heard two conflicting pieces of advice when it comes to EQing, when it comes to so many other things. You've also probably heard people say you should try going for a fast attack compressor on your mix bus. You might have also heard people say, you know what? Really what you want to do is have a kind of slower compressor, slow attack to let those transients through. You've probably heard all sorts of things about mix bus compression. And I'll tell you right now that any of these things that I've said to you so far could work and could be the right approach for you, depending on what your goals are, what your aesthetic goals are, what your workflow is like. It really depends on what you're looking for. But I think I can give you a way of thinking about mix bus compression that's going to allow you to answer these questions much more easily and with a lot more confidence, and pick a style that's going to work right for you for a given project. I think I'm going to skip the big sponsor shout out section at the beginning of this one and just mention our sponsors later on, because we're going to try to do a somewhat short and tight episode this week. So I'll shout out Sound Toys, Gear Club, and Mixing Breakthroughs later on. So right now, let's dive right into this idea of mix bus compression. And I will tell you that one person who is a little influential to me in the way that I think about mix bus compression was Charles Dye, who did one of the very first kind of major video productions about how to mix that I ever saw. This was in the early 2000s when people still bought DVDs. I actually bought this on DVD. It was an expensive DVD in those days. I think it was like $50 when $50 is more money than it is today. And I got this DVD, and one of the things he talked about around mix bus compression was there being two distinct approaches to mix bus compression, both of which he had some success with. One of those was to use a kind of SSL style bus compressor with a somewhat faster attack. And he said he would have a lot of luck with that strategy if he put that kind of compressor on somewhat early in the mix and started mixing through it. But he said that he found that when he was doing that kind of compression, it wouldn't work quite as well if he had already completed his mix and now just wanted to throw a mix bus compressor on it, that doing significant amounts of gain reduction with that kind of fast SSL style compressor wasn't working as well. And he felt like he couldn't get away with as much compression. And in those cases, he would go back and try to use a kind of slower compressor, generally doing less compression when he was putting on a compressor after the fact. And I remember hearing that and trying both styles of compression, trying to wrap my head around it, and years later, coming back to the understanding that he was right. There are two different ways to use bus compression, and one of those ways will often allow you to get away with more compression, and one of them might allow you to get away with less compression. And it really depends to a degree on the aesthetic you're going for. Some types of music can stand up to a lot of compression. Some types of music demand a lot of compression. Certain types of hard rock or metal or even pop and hip hop productions ask for a lot of compression. And there's other styles of music that really want to be compressed less, and a more gentle compression strategy can be your friend. But let's pretend for a minute that you're working in a genre where a significant amount of compression makes sense. What Charles Dye recommended then, and what has come up so many times in the almost decade that I've been talking to masters in their craft at recording, at production, at mixing, has come up again and again. A lot of the best mixers out there tend to put on their compressors fairly early in the mix and mix through them. And I know this is going to disappoint the thousands of people who saw this other video, smearing this approach. But it happens to be true that again and again, when I talk to the highest level mixers, I would say the larger portion of them tends to put on their mix bus compressors fairly early and makes mix decisions through that mix bus compressor. Because they found what Charles Dye found and tried to explain to me more than a decade ago, which was if you've already perfected your mix, like you've gotten your mix as perfect as possible, and then you throw a compressor on it, what's that compressor going to do to your mix? It's going to change it, right? It's going to sound different. And all of these settings you went through, all of this heartache you went through to get things just right, you are to a degree undoing that, or at least changing that by putting the compressor on it. So what so many of the most sophisticated mixers who rely on a lot of bus compression do is get that on fairly early. And the way that bus compressor responds is informing all of their mix decisions. It's informing their fader rides. It's informing their vocal rides. It's informing how much effect they use. It's informing the compressors they put on other instruments and other subgroups. Now, there's a lot of people who use mixing templates. And this is just as true for people in the analog domain mixing at a very high level. Often their assistant will come in, set things up for them, set up the gain staging for them, turn on their bus compressors already, and they're kind of mixing through them from moment one. And that happens with a lot of people who have DAWs. They will have, bus compressors in their DAW. They might have a main mix, compressor, as well as perhaps subgroup compressors on other instrument groups. And they'll be maybe mixing through those for moment one. Other people might do a pass where they're getting levels first without any compressors. And then once they feel like they've really got the levels established, roughed in a fairly good place, then they'll start kicking in those bus compressors. So that's another approach. There are people who will turn on compression much later. And again, that can work too. But I find that those mixers who get away with doing the most mix bus compression, these people who are compressing more than the magazines tell you you're supposed to, are those people who are mixing into them, turning them on early. And some of these people get absurd amounts of compression. Dan Corniff, who recently presented at MixCon, near the end of his MixCon presentation, you can hear him talk about his mix bus approach. And he actually has two compressors on his mix bus. It's this compressor plugin he designed himself. It's got his name on it, Corniff. And it's actually two SSL bus compressors, one going into the other in series with an EQ between them. And he said that he will get sometimes 5 or 10 dB of bus compression happening across a mix. For some of these styles of really processed heavy rock music he's working on, that can make sense. Now, I'm not here to say go forth and try to aim for 5 to 10 dB of compression on your mix bus and on your mixes. I'm not saying that's necessarily what you should do, but it's not something you should be afraid to try. And it's not something that you're going to have great results with if you just try to put it on at the end. Again, the people who are getting away with this approach of having more mix bus compression, where maybe they're doing at least 3 to 4 dB of compression quite often through something like an SSL bus compressor, they might be using relatively higher ratios, something like a 3-to-1 or a 4-to-1. And often, but not always, relatively fast attack times. Dan Corniff, again, in his recent MixCon presentation, he mentioned that he will often kind of use these in series. We actually talked about serial compression in last week's episode. And he will often have one of these compressors being kind of fast-ish attack and one being a more slow-ish attack. And why you'd stack compressor attack times like that is something, again, we talked about in the prior episode on advanced compression techniques, in particular serial compression. Then there's a totally other style of compression, and that is slower compression, lower ratio compression. And if you're going to be adding on your compressor late in your mix, it probably is often a better idea to use lower ratios, something like 1.5-to-1. 2-to-1 might be the highest you'd go. And instead of getting away with 3 or 4 dB of compression and kind of making it work because you're mixing through it and making all of your mix choices through the compressor, maybe you'd be getting 1 and 2 dB of compression at the most. So those are two different schools of thought, but I shouldn't treat them as if they're two distinctly different schools of thought because there's so much crossover. Dan, I'm going to bring him up one last time. In the particular mix he showed at MixCon was using a really slow attack compressor. It was like I think his attack was like 30 milliseconds or something to really let some transients through with a really fast release to kind of get some pump. And that's another way some people might use compression on their mix bus, with a slow attack, fast release to get more pump, more life, more breath, more sizzle out of it. Other people might be looking for more control out of their compressor. And when you're looking for more control, maybe you're looking for a faster attack time. Now, faster attack time might make your mix a little too dull, but if you're mixing through it and you're able to bring excitement and attack and impact to your subgroups and your individual tracks, well, then you can often get away with it. And then for those people who are using lower ratio compressors, those will often, be maybe slower attack time, medium to slow attack time, maybe a medium to medium fast release, something more gentle. And there's one more little but important thing I should mention about mix bus compression, and that is that your mix bus compressor is going to react very differently depending on how much low end you are sending to that mix bus compressor. One mistake a lot of people make early on is they will send way too much low end to their mix bus compressor. So the kick drum and the bass might have a ton of energy behind them, and that might be the only thing that is triggering that mix bus compressor. And that's something that you want to watch out for. You want to make sure that you're not overloading your mix bus compressor with a ton of bottom end. Now, there's two ways around this. One is that if you need a ton of bottom end, you don't hit your mix bus compressor with a ton of bottom end, but you kind of keep things controlled and then add more bottom end after the mix bus compressor. And another way to go about it is to use a sidechain EQ. And this is more and more increasingly built into mix bus compressors, where you might have a high pass function built in automatically where you click the button and then all of a sudden this compressor does not react as much to low frequencies as it does to other things. And this is really important because chances are you don't want your mix bus compressor only compressing your kick drum and nothing else. If anything, you can probably get a lot more benefit out of your mix bus compressor by having it focus more on compressing the mid-range of the record, where things often tend to be sloppier and more erratic, and then controlling the dynamic range of your low-end instruments on their subgroups or on those instrument channels alone. So that is one thing to be mindful for. Both look and listen for what your mix bus compressor is reacting to. And be careful that you're not sending it a whole bunch of sub information that you can't even hear on your little speakers in your poorly treated room. And use those meters to just double check and see, whoa, is my kick drum pegging this mix bus compressor, but nothing else? And if that's the case, you're probably not going to get the results you really want to get out of your mix bus compressor. So when you are dealing with mix bus compressors, there are really just a few variables at play. And let's think about them really concretely. One, you can either be going for a fast attack or a slow attack. And you need to ask yourself, what do I want out of this mix? Am I trying to add more control, more sheen? Then a faster attack compressor might make more sense. If you want to bring out more punch, more excitement, a slower attack compressor might make more sense. Then there's the ratio. Do you want a somewhat higher ratio compressor, 3-to-1 or 4-to-1? If that's what you're doing, you might want to consider putting that compressor on somewhat early in the mixing process. That seems to be what works for a lot of people. Whereas if you're working with a lower threshold compressor, you might be able to get away with putting that thing on later in your mixing process. Then there's the amount of compression. And everything I just said applies to amount of compression as well. If you're in a genre where you're expecting to use a lot of mix bus compressor, you probably want that mix bus compressor on your mix early on, and you probably want to be mixing through it, making decisions through that mix bus compressor. But if you're in a genre where a lot of compression isn't the thing, much more organic styles of like jazz and, maybe some forms of adult contemporary and that kind of stuff, where there's supposed to be a much more open feel and much less compression and much more dynamic range, then you might not want to put your compressor on until close to the end. Sure, you really want to do as much as you can with just level rides and good mixing, and then maybe you're adding a little bit on the end, and maybe that's doing very little compression, maybe at most a dB or two, and maybe it is kind of a slower, smoother compressor. And the last thing I want to think about is that there is the mojo of the compressor, and this is a little bit more ephemeral and harder to talk about, but the two major schools of mix bus compressor that are most common are something that is going to be fast, responsive, maybe somewhat aggressive, maybe respond well to a lot of compression. And the iconic thing here is like an SSL style compressor. The G series bus compressor is one of those things that like everybody uses on their mix bus, particularly in certain forms of rock music. And that's kind of one school of the tighter, more aggressive mix bus compressor. And then there's the kind of the fatter, smoother, more mojo-y mix bus compressor. And two emblematic versions of this would be, say, something like a Manley Varimu or the iconic Fairchild tube compressor that's really adding more girth and weight. And obviously, either style of these compressors can be used with a slow attack or a fast attack, et cetera, but they might be associated more with one style or the other of compression. Now, I could go into so much more detail on this and talk about what exactly is a fast attack time, what exactly is a slow one, how fast, how slow do you want to set your release time, how do you find that out? I go into a lot more detail on all of those nerdy specifics and the Mixing Breakthroughs course, which you can check out at mixingbreakthroughs.com. Like I said, I want to keep this week's podcast a short, tight one, see if you guys like this shorter format. So I'm not going to go into all of the gory details like I so often do. But hopefully this has kind of whet your appetite. If you want to hear even more on this topic, email me at podcast@sonicscoop.com or comment whether in YouTube or on Facebook or anywhere else you may be seeing or hearing this podcast. Speaking of incredibly great products like Mixing Breakthroughs, which you can find at mixingbreakthroughs.com, which will teach you all about how to hear compression, how to use compression both on individual tracks and on your buses and on your mix bus, there's also a couple of other great sponsors of this week's podcast. Big shout out to SoundToys, making some of my favorite plugins in the known universe. Check out anything they make for free at soundtoys.com. Some really cool effects there. And Gear Club, if you want a whole nother take, not just one other take, but a ton of other takes on mix bus compression and so many other things, check them out at gear-club.net. That's gear-club.net or Gear Club, wherever you get your podcasts. Some really amazing interviews, ton of great audio topics there at Gear Club. Since today was a short episode, you have all of this time to listen to other podcasts. Today might be the day that you check out Gear Club. Check them out at gear-club.net. This has been Justin Colletti of Sonic Scoop, talking your ear off about mix bus compression. Hope you enjoyed it. Thanks for hanging out with me. See you next time.